AP U.S. history students everywhere, hello, and welcome to yet another episode of APUSH Today. My name is Peter Piccone, and I am a San Marino High School AP U.S. history teacher with over 30 years of teaching experience. I'm also a blogger, keynote speaker, podcast host, and frequent teacher conference presenter. In today's video, we will be exploring APUSH Topic 5.2, Manifest Destiny. But what exactly will you need to know about this topic? You're probably wondering. Well, for starters, you'll need to know that the term manifest destiny can best be defined as a widely held American belief of the 19th century that suggested American settlers were destined to expand across North America. In other words, manifest destiny, as I tell my students, was the belief that the United States of the 1800s was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. With this 1872 painting by artist John Gast capturing the views of many, if not most Americans at the time. See the American settlers moving west? With those settlers filled with the spirit of manifest destiny and guided by Columbia, the female figure of America? Also see how Columbia's westward expansion is aided by technology, such as railroads and the telegraph? And do you see how westward expansion is driving the Native American and the bison into obscurity and bringing the light, as witnessed on the eastern side of the painting, towards the darkened west? That's what manifest destiny was all about, a combination of good, bad, and ugly. But is a definition of this term and the ability to describe what's in this image all that you're going to need to know for the May exam? Well, the answer to that question can be found in the APUSH Topic 5.2 Learning Objective, with this learning objective suggesting that you're not just going to need to know what manifest destiny is, but that you're also going to need to know what were the causes and effects of westward expansion from 1844 to 1877, with 1844 being the year in which James K. Polk was elected president, and 1877 being the year in which Reconstruction ended. Before actually trying to address the topic 5.2 learning objective, I first want to describe for you the extent of American expansion prior to 1844. And the best way for me to do that is to have you now take a close look at the map on the screen before you. Here you can see that the United States prior to 1844 consisted of about 26 states, with several of these states located west of the Appalachian Mountains, aka the Trans-Appalachia, and almost all of these Trans-Appalachian states having been carved out of the 1803 purchased Louisiana Territory. But what about the Trans-Appalachian population prior to 1844? In other words, how many Americans lived west of the Appalachians? Well, in fact, nearly 7 million Americans prior to 1844, that's 40% of the nation's population, lived in the Trans-Appalachian. But they not only lived there, they also traveled through there, making their way west, most often along either the California Trail, the Gila Trail, or the Oregon Trail. In other words, prior to 1844, many Americans had already migrated to and settled on our country's west coast. However, it wasn't until after 1844 that massive number of Americans pulled up stakes and headed west. That's when there was a significant push toward the west coast of North America, not before. And what caused this era of massive immigration and the settlement to take place? Well, the answer to this question can be found in Key Concept 5.1.1a. But with so much text to read here, my guess is that you, before being able to answer my question, will need some time to look over this key concept. And if that's true, then please go ahead and pause this video for a minute or two right now. And then, when paused, read over this key concept word for word in an attempt to answer the question, what caused so many Americans to migrate westward between 1844 and 1877? Okay, so now that you're back, could you do it? Could you find the answer to my question? What you should have come up with is that Key Concept 5.1a suggests that there were essentially three things that caused Americans to expand westward between 1844 and 1877. With these three things appearing on the slide before you and often referred to as the pull factors. A pull factor is something positive that draws a people to someplace new. And a good example of the first pull factor mentioned on this slide, or to put it another way, a good example of those who moved westward in search of natural and mineral resources were those who history calls, and I'm sure you can guess it, they were called the California Gold Rush prospectors, with more than 300,000 of them having migrated to the state in less than 10 years, and with the largest number having arrived in 1849, hence the reason why these prospectors are often simply referred to as the 49ers. But the California gold fields didn't only attract prospectors living in the East. Many businessmen living west of the Rocky Mountains were also lured to California in the hope of striking it rich. But these folks, they didn't come in search of natural and mineral resources. Rather, they came in search of economic opportunities associated with the intent of selling food and supplies to the prospectors, with the names of three of the more famous and super successful gold rush merchants appearing on the slide before you. Now, true, you're not going to need to know their stories. Nonetheless, I encourage you to now pause the video and see what you can find out about these three on the internet. Fascinating tales, you'll no doubt conclude. For a good example of a group that migrated westward in the hope of finding religious refuge. In other words, they came west with a pull factor other than the two I've already mentioned. You want a good example of that? You can't do any better than mentioning the Mormon Pioneers, with the term Mormon Pioneers referring to about 70,000 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who migrated in the mid-1840s from the Midwest to the Salt Lake Valley in what is today the state of Utah, but back then was a part of Mexico. And why were the Mormons seeking religious refuge in Mexico? What were they trying to get away from? The push factors, if you will? Well, the answer to that question, in a word, is persecution, with this slide mentioning the three most often cited reasons for that persecution. And now, to go off in a slightly different direction, it's time for me to talk about what boosted westward migration. In other words, it's now time for me to answer the question, what helped or encouraged westward migration to increase? With the answer to that question appearing in Key Concept 5.1.1d. Two things, it says there, boosted westward migration between 1844 and 1877. One, the passage of new legislation promoting Western transportation, and two, the passage of new legislation promoting economic development, with the word legislation meaning laws passed by Congress. The best example of new legislation that promoted Western transportation between 1844 and 1877 is something called the Pacific Railway Act. This law of Congress, passed during the Civil War, promoted Western transportation by in essence calling for the building of the country's first transcontinental railroad, with this railroad, when completed less than a decade later, running along a nearly 2,000-mile continuous route from Iowa to California. As for a good example of new legislation that was passed between 1844 and 1877 and that promoted economic development, you can't do any better than mentioning the Homestead Act. This law of Congress, also passed during the Civil War, essentially gave 160 acres of free land to any person who'd build a house on the Great Plains, live there for 5 years, and engage in some kind of farming of the land, with an acre being the approximate size of your school's football field. And with all that said, there's just one more thing I need to do before closing out this video, and that's to explain the effects of manifest destiny and westward migration, with the three most important effects mentioned on the slide now before you, and with this slide making very clear the substantial increase in the land that we could and would claim as ours as a result of manifest destiny and westward expansion. Fascinating, isn't it? The land that we acquired between 1844 and 1877 as a result of the U.S. either having annexed it, purchased it, established it, or by way of having granted it statehood. And with all that said, the topic 3.4 learning objective has been fully addressed, and therefore this relatively long episode of APUSH Today must now come to an end. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been an honor and a privilege. This is Peter Piccone signing off.